And in some ways, I wonder if the perspectives aren't more, what's the word I'm looking for? I mean, in some ways they're not more stereotypical, or they're more, I mean, I think of a country like Iraq, and this is what, to me, what haunts me as a journalist there is, I'm saying policymakers, let's say, the government understood Iraq as Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds before the invasion. And through a series of policies, of decisions, of 7 years of creating a new political, body politic, we've actually made that cliche, that stereotype, the reality in some ways, which is just overwhelming. I mean, I wonder, and that's one thing I kind of think about with all this, a country like Iraq, a story that we've just, one editor remarked to me that no story hasn't been written about that country at this point. And I still don't think we have a real grasp of what, what it was, what it is, and what it's becoming. And it's very frustrating to me.
Right, right. No, I think that's the case. I mean, so with the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's this sense, and there always has been among students and a lot of the public, that, these people have been fighting each other for thousands of years. These sort of deep essences of who these people are clashing with each other. And so what I find which of course is absurd.
Right.
It's a political problem, and you can trace how those tensions have emerged and evolved over time. And so, for example, you're talking about the notion of Shias and Sunni and Kurds. There's this sense that these are also sedimented identities, group identities out there. They're salient. They're long established. They're deeply rooted in the soil, even. And these people have been fighting each other forever, and we know that from Lebanon, and we know that from, fill in blank of your conflict, that these people just fight each other. And of course that's not accurate as well. And so one of the questions I had, thinking about Lebanon and applying it to Iraq a bit, is that, during the Civil War, for example, there was the 15-year civil war in Lebanon, there was no conflict between Muslims, between Sunni and Shias. And yet today, Lebanese are remembering those conflicts as it's always been fighting between the Sunnis and Shias. And similarly in Iraq, we're talking about, oh, well, they're never going to get along, that's why we have to come up with this system, when in fact the political structures are making those identities salient. And so I'm wondering if you've seen that the sort of almost making those identities more real and more politically powerful than they were before? And has that changed in the past, 7 years in ways that we're not really seeing?
Did you see that? I'll answer that, but I just want to ask you a quick question. I mean, if we think back to like when we were in CASA together, for instance, I don't even remember being sectarianism wasn't really a notion out there.
I talked about it all.
It's not that long ago even that we talked about this. What's so weird to me is that in some ways, I think back to, I went to Cairo as a reporter in 1995. In some ways, the Middle East isn't, like I said this earlier, it's not recognizable to me. And in terms of these conflicts and these conflicts being kind of framed that way, I mean, Iraq's the best example of it. You cannot, as a journalist, and I'd be curious, how it is for a scholar, but as a journalist, it's almost impossible to write beyond that kind of very simplistic, almost primordial notion of identity that, just as you said, it's always been, of course, an issue in Iraq, but it wasn't the sole axis around which politics would revolve. And there's this incredible, I find it among American officials especially, this incredible naivete of their role in, either a naivete or a willful disregard of what they did, but of how that system has evolved under their watch into the system it is today. I was just reading a briefing, in fact, on the new government being formed. A government, and I remember this one, what they call a senior administration official, said it was the first truly inclusive cross-sectarian government in Iraq's history. And, I looked at that and I said, the argument you can make is that's the first truly sectarian government. I mean, for the first time, it's basically every position in that government's been divvied up, depending on whether you're Sunni, Shiite, or Kurd. It's turned the country into this kind of, very simplistic idea of what a body politic might be. And I think it's going to be disastrous. I mean, I think that the repercussions of that haven't even started. And we really don't even understand what the process was in creating it. It's tough. And then I'll sit down and write a story, and then I throw out those same words. And I don't know how. My challenge is how do you get beyond that 1,100 words? And I'm not sure the answer to that. How, as a scholar, I guess, how would you, what would you see as the approach to making sense of that or understanding that changing kind of notion of identity?
So I'm not quite sure how to answer, but one of the things that comes to mind is when I was talking to people in the mid-90s when I was doing my field research in Jordan and Yemen, where I was there for a long period, talking about Hawiya, which is your identity, as just everybody assumed it was your identity card. And you go, no, but your identity. And they're
Right.
like, well, it's here, you know, and that didn't mean anything else.
So true.
And in Jordan, this last trip, people were talking about Hawiya in a sense that we talk about it. You know, are you identifying as tribal? Are you identifying as a member of this region or this camp?
That's very interesting.
And I was like, wow.
Huh. That's really interesting.
You know, we've ruined you, we academics. This is terrible.
Yeah.
But
and how orchestrated, I mean, I don't know how in the case of Jordan, but in Lebanon and Iraq, it is orchestrated.
Right,
And
right.
It's incredible. And U.S. policy, you know, has a huge, you know, I think it's had a huge impact on that across the region. I mean, this idea of rallying Sunni support against Iran. I mean, there's clear
Right.
policies that were taken, you know, I mean, with King Abdullah in Jordan,
Right.
with, you know, Mubarak. I mean, these people were, you know, everyone was very cynical in using these as a way to
right,
get...
yeah, the regimes have, that's the thing, the regimes have this vested interest in portraying, and sometimes the fear is real, but portraying these conflicts as about, you know, Iran in the Shia crescent, and this is the big fear, therefore
Right.
we need more support, we need aid, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we were talking recently about the Houthi conflict in Yemen.
Right.
So Yemen, you have, you know, the sort of Zaidi community, which is a Shia group, but we don't think of it as part of the Shia world,
Right.
the Shia crescent, because of course it's not a crescent spatially anymore, and
Yeah.
that just messes up these nice little catchphrases. But in reality, they're Shia, but it's not necessarily relevant to anything,
Right.
and so that's why we don't think of them as Shia, and that's right. And yet, with the Houthi rebellion, the sort of Saudis' concern that, you know, Iran as Shias are aiding these other Shia rebels, suddenly we can draw those connections, and suddenly everybody's hair is up, and now it's
Right.
a concern. It's not just Al-Qaeda, but it's Shia in Yemen, and what's going to happen there. And so I think, you know, a lot of the rhetoric isn't just, you know, superficial descriptions. It actually ends up taking political force.
Absolutely, absolutely, and then the cynicism behind, I mean, just like you said, as a way to, like, for the Saudis to, you know, to go to the Americans and complain about something. The same thing in Iraq, in the sense that, you know, any support for a Shia constituency becomes default support for Iran in that country. I mean, and people fall into that game. I mean, I guess I wonder what, you know, you look back. I mean, going back to even the note, like what Sadat would have done after, you know, after the death of Abdel Nasser, in trying to kind of court the Islamists or try to, you know. Not create a more Islamic identity, but use the Islamists as a counterbalance to the left or to nationalists. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this kind of long history of manipulation, but I guess I wonder, looking at how explosive or how combustible it's become in this decade, what's the primary force driving it? And that's, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, is it all
During the
orchestrated?
resurgence of this kind of Islamist politics?
Or this kind of, this different, I don't want to just say sectarianism, but that manipulation of identities, let's say, maybe in politics. I just wonder, is it a, you know, part of me thinks if you look in a case like Iraq, it's, there's a sense of existentialism almost. I mean, like, you know, it's survival in some ways, and if we don't band together, we're going to be exterminated. I mean, there's that kind of language there. I mean, Lebanon would be in some ways the same, but is this coming from, you know, from below? Is it being manipulated by powers that be? I wonder what's the primary force kind of driving this.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a single force. I mean, certainly it's not the same in, you know, every state. And so, you know, Iran and Lebanon are places where it's particularly acute. I think in Yemen, you also have Sunni and Shia communities, and those weren't necessarily clashing as Sunni and Shia communities. They were clashing over other reasons, north-south, you know, socialism, Islamic conservatism, what have you. But they, you know, if they map on those lines, they can be sort of pushed along those lines. But for places where it is really strong, I mean, I think there's a couple things. You have, if you create, as we're doing in Iraq, state institutions that make those identities salient, then of course you're going to have these sort of identity entrepreneurs on the ground that are going to go around and say, look, Shia, look what's happening. You have to get with me. You can't be talking to this guy over here and working with them. Our interests are at stake. Our survival of our community is at stake. And then when people's experiences show that to be true, they see attacks on Sunnis or see attacks on themselves as Shia, then it's particularly problematic.